Step into the Wild West, where legends are born and blood stains the dust. Don't forget to subscribe and ride with us through history's deadliest tales. The West was never silent. It breathed with dust storms and thunder, with the gunfire of men chasing glory and the cries of those crushed beneath it. Yet in every saloon, every mining town, and every camp on the edge of nowhere, there were eyes watching, hands working, and voices whispering, voices that history would try to silence. These were the women of the frontier, and some of them chose a path darker, sharper, and more unforgettable than any dime novel dared to tell. They called the West a man's world. Men drove the cattle herds, robbed the banks, stood at high noon with revolvers gleaming. Women, they said, were supposed to be schoolteachers, wives, or shadows behind lace curtains. But lace tore easily in the desert wind, and shadows often learned to bite. The frontier was merciless. It chewed up the weak and spat them into graves or saloons. And in that crucible, some women became more dangerous than the outlaws they loved, outshot or betrayed. The men who wrote history ignored them. To the Eastern newspapers, outlawry was the sport of Jesse James, Billy the Kid, Butch Cassidy. But in smoky saloons from Kansas to New Mexico, old-timers leaned close and whispered of others, women whose names still carried the taste of whiskey and gunpowder. There was the girl in a scarlet dress no more than 16 who smuggled a pistol in her garter and shot a cattle baron in the leg when he tried to drag her upstairs. There was the widowed ranch wife who buried 3 husbands, each rumored to have died under mysterious circumstances, and who rode the prairie with a rifle across her lap, daring any man to ask her why she never remarried. There was the Mexican smuggler's daughter, Gata, who prowled the Rio Grande with eyes like burning coals and left behind only playing cards marked with blood. But these were just fragments, ghosts caught between truth and legend. What made the outlaw women different was not that they lived outside the law. Everyone in the West, in one way or another, danced with lawlessness. No. The difference was that they refused to be background characters in someone else's story. They were not content to be wives waiting at home or barmaids pouring whiskey. They seized their own power, however brutal or brief, and carved their names into the desert rock. Imagine the saloon at midnight. Sawdust on the floor, cigar smoke hanging like fog. A poker game stretches too long. The whiskey flows too freely. In the corner, a man brags about riding with the James Younger gang, his hands slamming down cards. But beside him, listening with a sly smile, sits a woman whose name history will never write down. She knows more about guns than the braggart ever will. She's hidden knives in her boots, coins in her corset, secrets in her eyes. Tomorrow she might vanish with a saddlebag of gold, or she might be found with her throat slit in an alley. No chronicler will remember her, yet she represents the countless forgotten faces who lived and died on the razor's edge of the frontier. It was a cruel paradox. The same society that denied women land, property, or even the right to vote also created the conditions for them to become outlaws. Poverty, violence, and abandonment drove many to desperate choices. A saloon girl robbed a drunk miner because it meant eating tomorrow. A homesteader poisoned her cruel husband because there was no law that would save her otherwise. And when newspapers wrote of these women, they painted them as monsters, or worse, ignored them entirely. But among these shadows were women who stepped boldly into infamy, whose legends grew too large to bury. Names like Belle Starr, Calamity Jane, and Pearl Hart burned their way into Western myth. They were not saints, far from it. They lied, they stole, they fought, they killed, but they also defied, resisted, and refused to be erased. The outlaw women of the West were not a sisterhood in the way modern minds might imagine. They never sat together around a fire, never shared secrets of rebellion. Most never met, and many would have despised one another. Yet they were united by circumstance and by choice. Women who broke out of cages, women who refused silence. Their stories ripple through time because they remind us that the Wild West was never simple. It wasn't just men riding into the sunset with six-shooters. It was also women who fought for survival, women who drank, who cursed, who outdrew men at their own game. Some were tragic, some triumphant, but all unforgettable once their shadows are pulled back into the light. And so our tale begins. This is not the polished West of Hollywood, where women are painted as saloon ornaments or helpless damsels. This is the real, blood-stained, whiskey-soaked frontier. Over the coming nights, you will hear of Belle Starr, the bandit queen who turned betrayal into power. You will walk beside Calamity Jane, torn between myth and misery. You will step into the half-lit world of saloon girls who carried secrets sharper than their stilettos. And you will meet the nameless ones, the ghosts, the women history tried to forget. The frontier was cruel, but it never forgot those who fought back. And if you listen closely, past the gunshots and the dust, you might still hear them whispering their stories. The saloon doors swung open with a creak, and silence fell over the smoke-choked room. Every man inside knew her name, but none dared to speak it too loudly. She was Belle Starr, rider of the outlaw trail, lover of desperados, and queen of her own destiny. Born Myra Maybelle Shirley in 1848, she had not been raised to be a queen nor an outlaw. She was the daughter of a Missouri innkeeper, a girl who once practiced piano instead of pistol fire. But the Civil War tore her world to pieces. Bands of Confederate guerrillas swept across Missouri, among them Jesse James and the younger brothers. Belle's family lost nearly everything, and the polite world that might have caged her disappeared in the smoke of burning fields. It was in that chaos she discovered her power. She dressed in velvet and feathers, but beneath the satin was steel. She learned to ride hard, shoot straight, and speak the language of outlaws. Men underestimated her because of her beauty, and she wielded that like a weapon sharper than any blade. Whispers spread. She had ridden alongside Jesse James, laughed with the younger gang, schemed with Cherokee outlaws in Indian Territory. The truth was murkier. Belle thrived on legend as much as fact. When the dime novels began printing her name, she didn't deny the stories. She fed them. She let the world believe she was the bandit queen, draped in lace, pistols at her hips, daring any man to match her fire. And she was fire. In Young County, Texas, they said she once galloped into town on a black mare, a shotgun resting across her lap, daring the sheriff to stop her. He didn't. In Oklahoma, she was accused of horse theft, a crime that could have seen her hanged. She stood trial dressed in velvet, smiling sweetly, and turned the courtroom into her stage. The jury acquitted her. One newspaper man wrote that she could charm a snake from its skin. But beneath the glamour, Belle's life was as jagged as the frontier itself. Her lovers were outlaws, men like Cole Younger, Jim Reed, Sam Starr, each as reckless and doomed as the next. She buried more than one, left others behind. She was loyal only to herself and to survival. Love was as dangerous as any six-shooter, and Belle played the game better than most. Her story was not a fairy tale of rebellion. It was grit and betrayal. Survival in a world where a woman had no place unless she carved it with her own hands. Belle learned to command fear and respect because she had no other choice. And yet she carried herself with the poise of a queen, riding through the West in long gowns, pistols hidden beneath her skirts, a plume in her hat. She became a living contradiction, elegant, ruthless, untamed. Her reign did not last forever. In 1889, on a lonely road in Indian Territory, Belle Starr was ambushed and shot in the back. She died face down in the dirt, her killers never named. Some said it was a jealous lover. Others whispered it was revenge from an outlaw she betrayed. The truth remains buried beneath the dust. But death did not silence her. Newspapers across America splashed her name across their pages. Dime novels turned her into legend. She was no longer just Myra Maybelle Shirley. She was the bandit queen, immortal, infamous, unforgettable. Belle Starr proved that women of the West could not only survive the outlaw trail, they could rule it. She bent history to her will, and even in death she defied the silence that sought to erase her. And she was only the beginning. For behind her shadow stood another name, one whispered with awe and disbelief: Calamity Jane. The saloon smelled of sweat, smoke, and cheap whiskey. Glasses clinked, cards shuffled, and curses flew as miners and drifters tried to drown their loneliness in liquor. The double doors banged open, and in strode a woman in buckskins, her hat tilted low, a rifle slung across her back. She was laughing before she even reached the bar, the kind of laugh that could silence a room. "Calamity Jane," someone muttered, half in awe, half in dread. Jane slammed down a bottle, wiped her mouth with her sleeve, and spun on her heel. Across the room, a burly prospector had cornered a trembling youth, his fist raised. With the speed of a striking rattlesnake, Jane pulled her revolver and fired a warning shot into the ceiling. Splinters rained down. "You got two choices, mister," she drawled. "Let the boy walk, or let me put the next bullet where it counts." The saloon roared with nervous laughter, but the prospector backed off, muttering curses. The boy scurried away, wide-eyed. Jane holstered her pistol and took another swig. It was moments like these, half chaos, half performance, that fed the legend of Calamity Jane. Her real name was Martha Jane Canary. Born to poor parents, orphaned young, she was forced into survival by any means: mule skinner, washerwoman, scout. She dressed like men because dresses slowed her down, and she swore and drank harder than most cowboys. The name Calamity came from her own boasting. She claimed any man who crossed her invited calamity upon himself. Whether or not the story was true, she wore the name like a badge. Yet beneath the bravado was a woman endlessly searching for belonging, and for many, her most enduring tale was her connection to Wild Bill Hickok. In Deadwood, Jane often followed Hickok, sometimes like a shadow, sometimes like a guardian angel with a flask. Legend says she loved him with a ferocity that mocked propriety. Some claimed he returned her affection in quiet, fleeting ways. Others swore he only tolerated her. But if you asked Jane, whiskey on her breath and eyes blazing, she'd tell you, "Wild Bill was my man, and I'd fight the devil himself for him." One night, in a reimagined moment, Jane sat across from Hickok at a poker table, watching the candlelight flicker against his long mustache and sharp eyes. "You ever think of quittin'?" she asked. Hickok chuckled. "Quittin' what? Cards, guns, whiskey. Jane, you might as well ask me to quit breathin'." She leaned in, her voice low. "One of these nights, Bill, you'll find a man quicker on the draw, and when that day comes, I'll be there. You won't die alone." Perhaps those words were prophecy. For when Hickok was shot in the back during a poker game in Deadwood, Jane was said to have wept like a widow. She swore vengeance, swore she would kill the coward who took him. Whether she actually confronted Jack McCall or not remains tangled in rumor. But the grief was real. From that day forward, she carried Hickok's memory like a scar. Calamity Jane's life spiraled between bursts of fame and depths of misery. She joined Wild West shows, parading before crowds who gawked at her gun tricks and her profanity. Some nights she stumbled drunk, mocked by the same people who paid to see her. Other times she disappeared into the plains, nursing the sick during smallpox outbreaks, risking her own life for strangers. One story tells of Jane finding a family stricken by fever in a lonely shack. Without hesitation, she cooked, cleaned, and tended their wounds. For weeks she stayed, refusing to leave until they healed. None of them ever forgot her rough hands or the soft lullabies she sang when the children moaned in pain. That duality, reckless outlaw and tender caretaker, made Jane unforgettable. She lived like a storm, unpredictable and fierce, but she also carried a heart bigger than the frontier itself. In her final years, Jane's body gave way to the excesses she had demanded of it. Tuberculosis gnawed at her lungs, whiskey burned her liver, and poverty clung to her like a second skin. Yet even then, she laughed. "Death," she said once, "ain't no worse than hangover on a cold morning." When she finally died in 1903, the people of Deadwood honored her last wish. They buried her beside Wild Bill Hickok. Whether he had ever truly loved her or not no longer mattered. In death, she claimed the place she had always wanted, next to the man who haunted her every legend. Visitors to Deadwood still pause at her grave, whispering her name as if she might rise again, whiskey in one hand, revolver in the other. Calamity Jane, a woman who defied the world's expectations and left behind a legacy that blurs the line between truth and myth. And as the wind sweeps across the Black Hills, one can almost hear her laughter echoing, wild, free, and unforgettable. The piano clanged wildly in the corner, the notes drowning beneath drunken laughter and the rattle of dice. The saloon doors creaked open, letting in the dusty night air, and every man at the table turned his head as she walked in. Gata, the cat. No one knew her real name, but her green eyes cut through smoke like blades, and her smile promised either a kiss or a knife, depending on how you played your cards. She was one of the many saloon girls scattered across the Wild West, women who lived on the edge of survival, caught between the glitter of the lamps and the darkness that waited outside. Men thought them ornaments, paid to pour whiskey and pretend affection. But behind their painted lips and corsets, many were spies, thieves, and in some cases, killers. Gata's story was whispered from mining camps to cattle towns. They said she slit a man's throat in El Paso after he tried to drag her out the back door. Others swore she stole gold dust from drunken prospectors and vanished into the desert, only to appear months later in another town, wearing new jewels. She thrived in shadows, a reminder that outlawry wasn't only a man's trade. But Gata was not alone. Across the West, saloon girls played dangerous games. Some carried derringers tucked in garters, others slipped poison into glasses when a patron got too rough. The line between survival and crime blurred easily, especially for women who had been denied the safety of family or fortune. One of the most infamous of these forgotten women was Pearl Hart, the bandit queen of Arizona. Unlike Gata, Pearl's name was etched into newspapers. Born in Canada, restless and reckless, she drifted south until the frontier swallowed her whole. When money ran dry, she disguised herself as a man, armed herself with a revolver, and with a partner robbed a stagecoach near Globe, Arizona. Imagine it. A dusty road, the clatter of hooves, passengers gripping their belongings as a slight figure in ill-fitting clothes shouted for them to hand everything over. Only when Pearl pulled back her hat did they realize the outlaw was a woman. Shock rippled through the frontier. Women were supposed to be victims, not bandits. Pearl broke that rule with every shot she fired. Her capture was a spectacle. Crowds pressed against the jailhouse bars just to glimpse her, and newspapers dubbed her a lady desperado. Some called her wicked, others called her a heroine of rebellion. In court, she charmed jurors with wit and defiance, at one point declaring, "I shall never wear a corset again." She became both villain and celebrity, proof that even the prim rules of Victorian morality could not contain the raw chaos of the frontier. Yet for every Pearl Hart whose name made print, there were a dozen Gatas whose lives dissolved into rumor. Saloon girls vanished from records, buried beneath the shadows of the men they served and deceived. Some fled with outlaws, disappearing into Mexico. Some died in alleys behind the very saloons where they once laughed. Others reinvented themselves, changing names, moving towns, erasing their pasts. But imagine the truth behind those painted faces. How many of them carried daggers beneath lace? How many plotted escape as they poured another shot of whiskey? How many stood guard for outlaw lovers, signaling with a flick of a fan when the sheriff walked through the door? The West's saloons were theaters, and these women were actresses and assassins both. Their lives were a dangerous performance, their survival depending on a smile at the right time or a bullet. And when the lamps burned low and the last drunk collapsed into silence, Gata would step outside, gaze at the stars, and vanish into the night. No lawman ever caught her. No grave bears her name. She lingers instead in the whispers of history, a ghost of the frontier, one of the countless outlaw women whose stories the world forgot. Their names may be lost, but their presence shaped the Wild West as surely as any gunfighters. For in every saloon, in every mining camp, behind every outlaw raid, there were women whose choices carved legends, choices born not of glory, but of survival. The desert wind howls across the abandoned towns of the frontier, carrying with it the faint echo of spurs on wooden planks, the clash of glasses in saloons, and the whispers of names nearly erased from memory. History, as it is written in textbooks, tells us the West belonged to men, cowboys, sheriffs, and outlaws whose faces were carved into the mythology of America. But in truth, woven into the fabric of that rugged world were women whose choices and defiance shaped the West in ways the history books rarely admit. Outlaw women. They came from different corners of the world, yet their lives intersected at the edge of survival. Some, like Belle Starr, embraced notoriety, playing the role of the bandit queen until her story became inseparable from myth. Others, like Calamity Jane, blurred the line between truth and legend, leaving behind tales so tangled that historians still argue where fact ends and fantasy begins. Still others, Hart, Gata, nameless saloon girls who armed themselves with daggers and derringers, drifted through the shadows of history, remembered only in fragments, or not at all. Why were they forgotten? Part of it lies in power. The frontier was built on a narrative written by men, for men. Newspapers loved sensational stories but quickly dismissed women's roles as aberrations, not worth preserving. Historians of the 19th and early 20th centuries often saw these women as curiosities rather than figures of consequence. Even when their names appeared, it was through a lens of scandal, morality, or ridicule. Outlaw women were either demonized or romanticized, but rarely humanized, and yet their presence mattered. Imagine the saloon without the women who lured men into traps, carried secrets between rival gangs, or pulled a pistol when survival demanded it. Imagine the outlaw camps without the wives, lovers, and accomplices who kept the fires burning and the law at bay. The Wild West was not a stage populated solely by gunslinging men. It was a dangerous ecosystem, and women were part of its bloodstream. Even beyond crime, these women reshaped expectations. In an era where women were expected to marry young, stay silent, and live within the walls of domesticity, outlaw women lived loudly, often violently. They defied corsets and conformity. They dressed as men, smoked cigars, gambled in backrooms, and rode horses into the desert night. Whether admired or condemned, they broke rules simply by existing outside the roles society assigned to them. But their legacy goes further than rebellion. They embodied survival in its rawest form. For many, outlawry was not a romantic choice. It was the only option left. A saloon girl who poisoned an abusive patron, a widow who turned to stagecoach robbery when starvation loomed, a woman who disguised herself to ride with a gang because the world had already shut its doors to her. These were not fairy tales. They were acts of endurance, of carving agency out of a world determined to deny it. And perhaps that is why their stories linger in whispers, half forgotten but never fully erased. Because they represent something larger than the frontier. They represent the eternal struggle of those who refuse to disappear quietly. Today, the outlaw women of the West inspire novels, films, and folklore, but rarely with the complexity they deserve. Too often, Belle Starr is reduced to a caricature, Calamity Jane turned into a drunken comic figure, Hart a quirky lady bandit. Yet behind the myths were flesh-and-blood women who laughed, wept, bled, and killed. Their lives deserve to be remembered not as sideshows, but as integral threads in the fabric of the Wild West. The desert wind does not discriminate. It carries the echoes of Jesse James and Billy the Kid, but it also carries the unmarked names of women who stood beside them, or against them. And if you listen closely, in the silence of ghost towns and the hollow shells of old saloons, you can still hear their voices. They are faint, but they are there, reminding us that history is never as one-sided as the books would have us believe. Outlaw women may have been forgotten by official history, but they carved their mark on the frontier as surely as any six-shooter. Their legacy is not just in the legends they left behind, but in the defiance they embodied, a refusal to be silenced, a refusal to conform, a refusal to fade into the background. And so the story of the West remains incomplete without them. The Wild West was never just a man's tale. It was also theirs. If you want to uncover more forgotten stories, more shadows behind the myths, then saddle up and ride with us. Hit like, subscribe, and join this journey through the untold history of the frontier, because the past still has secrets waiting to be unearthed.